Hello, viewers. Welcome back to Tech AI. Today's our 7th class of Illustrator, where we'll dive into gradients. We'll also cover how to effectively use the color panels to create gradients effortlessly. To demonstrate this, let's start. Firstly, I'll create a rectangle to showcase how gradients work and what type of objects they best suit. Let's open up the entire panel set. Now, let's focus on the Gradients panel. By default, Illustrator provides a white to black gradient. But what exactly is a gradient? It's a smooth transition between two or more colors, creating a blend that changes gradually. To apply a gradient to an object, ensure it's selected, then click on the desired gradient in the Gradient panel. You'll notice preset gradients available in the Swatches panel as well, which you can use or modify to create your own custom gradients. Let's clarify the use of gradient sliders below the Gradient panel. These sliders control the gradient's endpoints, one for white and the other for black. By adjusting these sliders, you can alter the colors smoothly across your object. Let's focus on adjusting gradients using sliders. For instance, if you replace black with red on the slider by drag and drop, your gradient will automatically update to reflect this change. Another method involves double-clicking these sliders, which opens a panel where you can fine-tune the colors further. Personally, I find it efficient to initially select colors from the Swatches panel and then make necessary adjustments. You can work with a minimum of 2 sliders or add more for complex gradients, although I advise against overly complicated combinations. Keeping gradients simple and focused on light to dark transitions typically yields better visual results, as discussed in color theory. Now, let's cover some basics. Imagine creating a gradient that starts with light blue and transitions to dark blue. Adjusting the gradient's tone is straightforward using the sliders. The top slider determines how colors blend across the gradient. Usually, it's best to keep this slider centered or adjust it by percentage for precise positioning. When you apply a gradient, it typically flows from left to right, with light colors on the left and darker colors on the right. To change the gradient's direction, avoid simply reversing the sliders. Instead, use the angle control. For example, setting it to 180 degrees flips the gradient horizontally. However, for more intuitive control over direction, utilize the Gradient tool. The Gradient tool displays a line over your gradient, allowing you to adjust its direction by dragging. For instance, clicking and dragging from top to bottom shifts the gradient accordingly. Remember, the starting point of your gradient is always where you click initially. Let's delve into managing gradients further. When adjusting gradients, remember that where you click determines where the light color begins, and where you release determines where the dark color ends. It's a straightforward concept that gives you control over the gradient's direction. Personally, I prefer placing the lighter color on the left side, but this can vary based on your preference. To change the direction of a gradient, simply click and drag. If you move the cursor slightly beyond the gradient line, a rotate option appears. This allows you to rotate the gradient as needed. Be cautious not to extend the gradient line too far beyond the object, as this can cause the gradient to spread out excessively. Bringing it back inside ensures the colors display correctly. Now, let's explore another type of gradient known as radial gradient. Unlike linear gradients that flow from one side to another, radial gradients emanate from the center outward. This means the center is lighter, transitioning to darker tones towards the edges. Using the Gradient tool, you'll notice a circle alongside the line. This circle adjusts the size of the gradient, while dragging the dot allows you to create oval-shaped gradients. This flexibility is particularly useful for objects with oval or circular shapes. Ensure the stroke is turned off when working with gradients, as you want the fill to be affected, not the stroke. Let's dive into creating a simple 3D box using default colors. Remember when we discussed using the Direct Selection tool to create shapes? I'm recreating that same 3D box now. Initially, the box appears with strokes, but in reality, 3D objects don't have strokes. So I apply a solid color, let's say brown, and turn off the stroke to give it a flat appearance. Now, to simulate realistic lighting effects, I'll use gradients. Remember, since we have three separate sides, we'll apply the gradient individually to each. Starting with one side, I select it and drop the same brown color into the gradient slider. Next, I delete the white from the gradient by dragging it outside. Note, you can't delete the black slider because gradients require at least two colors. To remove it, I hold Alt, click, drag, and release. A quick way to duplicate gradient sliders. Now, adjusting the sliders, I make one side darker using the HSB mode in the color panel. After slight adjustments to brightness and saturation, the gradient becomes visible. I want the same gradient on the other two sides, so I use the eyedropper tool to apply it. However, there's a flaw. The light should realistically affect the gradient direction. To correct this, I adjust the gradient slider on each side accordingly, ensuring a smooth transition. Remember, the gradient tool is sensitive, so holding Shift while adjusting ensures precision. For highlights, I add new sliders and lighten them slightly on the sides where light would naturally hit. This enhances the realism of the 3D effect. Now, let's leave the top of the box plain for simplicity. We've effectively created a 3D box without strokes, focusing on realistic lighting effects through gradients. Remember, strokes make objects look artificial, so always avoid them when creating 3D shapes. Instead, use gradients to simulate light and shadow, enhancing the depth and realism of your designs. Now, let's move on to creating a pencil using gradients, as we discussed earlier. I'll start with a basic hexagonal shape for the pencil. Let's continue by focusing on the initial color choice and adjusting from there. I start by darkening the red in the slider. After slightly darkening and increasing the saturation, I apply the same gradient to another section using the eyedropper tool. To ensure a natural look, I flip the gradient direction using the gradient tool while holding Shift for accuracy. Although the object initially looks flat and uninspiring, this will change soon. I reselect a specific section and proceed to add highlights or reflections. Instead of pure white, I opt for a light red that closely resembles white, achieving the desired effect. Everything seems to be progressing smoothly so far. However, I feel the need to darken a particular area slightly. By increasing saturation and decreasing brightness, I subtly enhance its appearance. On the left part, where I don't want to highlight, I use the eyedropper tool to match the gradient, and then remove the highlight. Next, I notice the object appears too thick, so I select the entire piece and manually reduce its width. After this adjustment, the curves need to be corrected since they've shifted downwards. Using the Direct Selection tool, I select the 3 points and shift them upwards while holding Shift to maintain alignment. Now, I want to add the wooden part below. Starting with a simple box, I ensure it aligns perfectly using the Smart Guides. After filling it with the appropriate color, I arrange it to the back using Arrange, Send to Back. Originally, I intended for this part to be triangular and pointed. To achieve this, I use the pen tool to add a point at the center of the selected shape. By clicking on the existing points with the pen tool, I remove unnecessary anchor points to shape it correctly. Zooming in, I notice a minor issue where the wooden part is too far inside while the green part protrudes outwards. To rectify this, I extend the length of the wooden part by selecting the appropriate point with the Direct Selection tool and pulling it downwards while holding Shift. Now, inside the wooden part, I want to apply a gradient effect. I simply drag and drop the same color onto the gradient slider, and duplicate the brown color, carefully adjusting the darkness to achieve a cone or cylindrical shape effect, ensuring two darker sides with a lighter middle. Let's continue with the process. I duplicate the darker slider using Alt and position it on the left side to create a subtle gradient effect. I adjust the highlight to align perfectly with the red part by dragging it into position. Now, what's next? That's the tip of the pencil. To create it, I'll use the same section. Remember the knife tool I taught you earlier? I use it to cut the section like this. Perfect. It's now a distinct part. Let's apply a gradient here. Black on both ends and white in the middle. Keep in mind, the tip of the pencil reflects a metallic shine. The spread of the gradient shouldn't be too long, so I keep the upper slider closer. This gives it a sharp metallic appearance. Alright, up to now, everything's done. Now I move on to creating the upper part where I want to place an eraser. The eraser sits on a metallic cylinder, so I start by creating that cylinder. I begin with a rectangle and give it a golden color. Golden shades typically start with yellow, which I darken slightly to achieve a mustard tone. I adjust the hue towards red or orange, maintaining a subtle saturation increase if needed. I position this part in the middle and create a copy for the mustard part. Since it's metal, I aim for a soft matte finish. Inside this cylinder, I need to insert the eraser. I start with a rounded rectangle, ensuring it stretches edge to edge. I fill the eraser with the orange color and decrease its saturation for a realistic appearance. Then, I apply a gradient inside it, incorporating darker and lighter tones for depth. After adjusting and arranging these elements, I ensure the eraser is sent to the back for proper layering. However, there's an issue with this part. It appears too flat. Realistically, designs aren't simply painted on, but often engraved or carved inward. To achieve this effect, I'll teach you a technique involving creating an illusion with gradients. Imagine I have a rectangle. I slightly adjust its gradient, either horizontally or diagonally. What's the purpose of this adjustment? Let me demonstrate by creating something on it. A small illusion. An illusion is a visual trick or deception. I start by making a square converted into stroke and filling it with the lighter tone from the gradient. I apply this as a stroke with a solid color. Using the selection tool, I delete a single point from the path. I specifically wanted an open path, so I use delete. Now I duplicate and rotate this shape back into place. You might wonder why I deleted it only to replace it. The point of deletion was to open up the path and create a specific visual effect. Let's continue with another technique. I duplicate the upper part and keep it yellow, while for the lower one, I choose for a darker shade. Now, observe closely after grouping them. When placed on this box, you'll notice it creates an embossed effect, making it protrude. This effect was commonly used in old Windows interfaces, such as with OK and cancel buttons. If rotated in the opposite direction, it appears engraved. The illusion works because our brain perceives light as coming from above, creating highlights on the upper parts and shadows below, thus emphasizing the embossed or engraved appearance. I take a copy, rotate it oppositely, and position it in the middle. Nice effect, right? Now, keeping this concept in mind, we can apply it creatively. I start by making a box filled with a solid color using the eyedropper tool, choosing yellow for the fill. Next, I duplicate it closely attached and fill it with a darker color using Shift to ensure I pick a solid color, not a gradient. After selecting both, I group them together, making them slightly narrower and shorter. I repeat this process, taking more copies and arranging them neatly on the pencil. To manage the number, I narrow them further and group them all together for easier handling. Now it looks much better, doesn't it? Our pencil is now complete. We'll move on to writing text on it soon, once we've learned the type tool in the next upcoming classes. Maybe after 1 or 2 more lessons. But yes, the pencil is ready. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please show your support by liking the video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do so for instant updates on future lessons. Next time, I'll return with more interesting techniques. Now, let's take things to the next level and see what we can achieve by applying gradients to the wristwatch you made in the last class. I'm excited to see what amazing results you'll achieve. See you next time. Thank you.